Hi, everyone. This is Marcus Penny, Digital Engagement Manager at NYLC. I'm very excited today to introduce our friend Kathryn Ross to give a little talk about grant writing, raising in that way. So in this, Kathryn is, so I'm just going to actually just hand it over to her right away to get started.
Thank you. I'm Kathryn Ross, and I'm really honored to be here today. I just want to thank all of you for your devotion to service to the community. The fact that you're interested in learning and service learning tells me a lot about you already, and I'm just delighted to be here today. And hopefully I can give you a few tips about development and grant writing. I'll just say quickly a couple things about myself. I'm an accidental grant writer. I was graduated with a degree in English, which can prepare you for everything or nothing, depending on your perspective. But I love writing. I love the arts. I love human services. So I worked for an arts organization. They needed a grant writer. They tapped me to do it. And I really kind of learned on the job. I guess the other thing I'll say quickly by way of introduction is I've been really fortunate to make my career working in the nonprofit sector. And I really want to encourage all of you, as you think about your career options, to consider working in the nonprofit sector. It is a wonderful way to do work that aligns with your values and your passion. It's a great way to make a difference in your community, which is something I know you already care about. And you can live your passion and values. So why don't we get started?
All right. Toggle over here. Good timing for the button to disappear. There we go. Whoops.
Okay, so this is just an intro slide. I'm Kathryn Ross, and I work at Julie Murphy and Associates. This is arguably one of the worst pictures that's ever been taken of me, but it just, again, tells you a little bit more about who I am.
Oh, sorry.
As I said, I've worked for about 25 years for a variety of arts and human service organizations, and I serve on a number of boards in the Twin Cities. One of them is an incredible organization called Culture Club Collaborative that pairs homelessness with artists. And I think I already mentioned that I have a degree in English. So today we're going to talk about grant writing. But before I dive into it, let me just say something about the difference between the terms fundraising and development. They're used interchangeably. When I think of the word fundraising, I tend to think of a financial goal that's being met. I like to use the word development because to me, development is about nurturing relationships. And nurturing relationships is really the key to getting the support, whether it's financial support or in-kind support or volunteer support, that you're going to need to do your work. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to be trying to talk a lot about relationships. The other thing I want to say quickly is, though, excuse me, although I'll be talking a lot about grant writing, I think a really balanced development program should be comprehensive. It should include things like individual giving, maybe special events, year-end letter writing appeals. A lot of you are much better versed with social media platforms than me. So you're probably familiar with things like GoFund campaigns, and those are all part of raising money. But today we're going to focus on grant writing. And it looks to me like part of the slide might be missing.
Okay. It's supposed to be here.
Yeah, there were supposed to be some images there. Here we go. So there are a lot of myths around grant writing. Grant writing is easy. Anyone can do it. Grant writing is actually a lot of work. So we're going to talk about how you need to prepare for it. Grant writing is not something that you want to do kind of haphazardly. You want to make sure that you do research, that you build an effective case for support. Not all grant makers are the same, and not all grants are the same. So we'll get into that a little bit more. Next slide. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about our agenda. This is really an introduction and overview to grant writing, and I'll try to give you some tips about what you should do before you even begin. The ins and outs of successful grant writing, and I'll try to use some examples from my own experience. And we'll end with 9 grant writing tricks of the trade. So my hope is that you will learn something. Okay, before you begin, let me just say something first before we get into is your organization a fit? You're probably wondering, how do I know what grant makers to approach? That's called prospect research. And there are a number of online databases. In Minnesota, we have, for example, the Minnesota Council on Foundations website. I think Minnesota Council on Nonprofits may have one. There are national directories, the Foundation Directory online. So, for example, for a youth-serving organization, you would go to one of these databases and you would use certain filters that would help you identify a list of foundations and corporations who'd be interested in funding your work. And you can do filters around education, around volunteerism, whatever special projects. Another way that you might want to identify potential funders for your work is to look at organizations that are doing similar work. And you might want to visit their websites, look at their annual reports, and see who's sponsoring their events. So that's something I just want to touch on quickly before we even get into, is your organization a fit? I mean, you need to determine what funders you're going to approach. So once you have a list of funders that you've identified that you think have a history of funding organizations similar to yours, you want to make sure that you carefully review their guidelines. And most funders do have pretty good guidelines that will tell you what kinds of grants they make, what kind of work they support, if they fund new programs, if they don't fund faith-based organizations. They should be giving you the information that you need to determine if your organization or project is even eligible. The other really important piece of advice I would give you here is, if you're not sure, call or email the funder. And in fact, I really recommend that you do that anyway. And for years and years, when I started grant writing, I was always scared to pick up the phone and call a program officer and ask if they'd be interested in funding my organization. And I'll tell you something, they are paid to take your phone call. And just knowing that that's their job really helped me overcome that barrier. So make sure you read the guidelines. And then what I would suggest you do if you're calling a foundation is to simply say, introduce yourself, be brief, say, I've read your guidelines. It appears that my organization or project might be a good fit. Here's what we want to do. And would it be something your foundation would be interested in funding? And they should be able to guide you. Do your homework. Once you decide that you can submit a proposal, make sure that you determine what kind of attachments you might need. Most of the time when you submit a proposal, they'll want a project budget. They may need a list of your board of directors. They usually do not fund you if you aren't a nonprofit organization, so you'll need proof of your nonprofit status. So make sure that all of the materials that you need are at hand, or that you have someone who can help you with that. Sometimes you'll see no unsolicited proposals. And if a foundation says no unsolicited proposals, usually what that means is they already have a group of organizations they fund. So if they say that there are no unsolicited proposals, that's another example where you're going to want to make sure you contact the foundation, because you don't want to go through all the work of writing a proposal only to find out you're not eligible. Okay, now we're going to kind of get into some of the nitty-gritty of proposal writing. Let's start by talking a little bit about what types of funders there are, because different funders have different motivations for wanting to fund you, and they have different, you're going to want to take a different approach with each one. For example, a public funder, these are usually federal, state, local government funders. What they typically do is issue something called an RFP, and an RFP means a request for proposal. Now, what's kind of interesting about public funders is they have already decided what they want to fund. They're usually very, very specific. They want to fund, for example, maybe job training programs for youth. They may want to fund chemical health programs. They may want to fund programs to support people coming out of corrections. So the interesting thing about public funders and these types of grants is you don't have to spend a lot of time building a case. You don't have to persuade them that youth experiencing homelessness, for example, deserves supportive housing. They've already made that decision for you, so you don't have to spend a lot of time on that. What often does happen, though, with public and federal grants is that you have to have a lot of data to support it. So, for example, if you were writing a proposal to create a program for youth experiencing homelessness, you'd want to have data about how many youth in your community are homeless, what kind of barriers they face. Typically, it's that kind of more academic, nuts and bolts information you'll need for a public funder. Corporate foundations, for example, in Minnesota, General Mills, Wells Fargo, Target, those are examples of corporate foundations. Those are corporations who set aside a percentage of their earnings to give back to the community. My experience with corporate foundations, they typically like to fund things like education, human services, sometimes the arts. A lot of times, the people who make the decisions, they'd use a lot of employee giving committees. And so your audience may not be people that are professionals in the field. So a lot of times when you're writing a grant to a corporation, you want to make sure that you talk about your work in terms that are accessible, that somebody, for example, who may not have expertise in your subject area, that they can understand. And my experience with corporations, too, is they often tend to shy away from controversial subjects. So just something to be aware of. Private foundations are foundations owned by individuals or institutions. For example, the McKnight Foundation is a private foundation, the Bush Foundation. A lot of these foundations are started often by people maybe who helped build businesses that really establish the communities. In the Twin Cities, a lot of these people created the original mining and manufacturing companies. With private foundations, they often have very well-established guidelines. A lot of times the program officers and the people you might work with, they really are experts in the field. And so you'll really need to make a case for why, for example, you might be the best organization to be doing the type of work you're doing, how you're creating best practices for the rest of the country. I know with NYLC, I think you have a partnership with Johns Hopkins. Things like that are going to really matter to them. Family foundations tend to be owned by families. Increasingly, family foundations do donor-designated funds, often with community foundations. Family foundations tend to have pretty much their family interests. So, if somebody in the family's been affected perhaps by addiction, they might have a focus on addiction. Sometimes, they have their kind of, what do I want to say? Things that matter to them that are historically important. Family foundations can kind of be tough nuts to crack, but they're worth looking into. Institutional foundations tend to be community foundations like the Minneapolis Foundation or St. Paul Foundation. These foundations pool funds from the community and typically also have very well-established funding programs. That's a lot of information about the difference between them, but as we get into talking about writing proposals, it does make a difference, I think, what audience you're writing for, whether it's a public funder, a corporate funder, or a private foundation. Okay, common types of grant applications. Usually a lot of funders want you to begin with a letter of inquiry. It's typically 1 or 3 pages, just introducing your project. And they use it to screen whether or not they think that you would meet their eligibility guidelines. And then they may or may not invite you to do a full proposal. We talked a little bit about request for proposals. Sometimes funders will contact an organization or a group directly. If they decide, for example, that they have a particular interest in youth, they may reach out specifically and invite you to submit a project. Increasingly, funders are doing online applications. And let me tell you, online applications tend to have very restricted word counts. One of the beauties of online applications is, in some ways, they're easier than paper applications. You hit a send button versus having to take a package to the post office to mail. But don't be fooled into thinking just because an online application is online that you necessarily can do it at the last minute. I've learned that the hard way. And also with a word count, sometimes you may only have 250, 1,000 words to tell your story. So what that means is you're going to have to make every word count. You really, really have to think very carefully about how you tell your story, what information you want to include. So that's what I have to say about online applications. Also with online applications, don't wait until the last minute. Often they will say things like, they're due by 11:59 p.m. Make sure you notice whether it's Central Standard Time. Online applications are unforgiving. Let's see here. Okay, components of a successful proposal. Oops, did I skip something? Excuse me. Okay, components of a successful proposal. These are just some of the content materials. A cover letter is pretty self-explanatory. It just says, this is who you are. This is what you're applying for, how much money, for what purpose. And it's a great place where you want to say right in the very beginning, we are applying to the Target Foundation because we know you're very interested in education and youth. You want to put that right up front. A cover sheet tends to be, they want to know things like your annual budget, how many people you serve. It's usually more statistical. Organization information, most proposals want to know things like your history, your mission, your history, how you got started, why somebody was passionate enough about what you're doing that they said, hey, let's start an organization. Or what's the need? Maybe somebody noticed there are a bunch of people who were sick and also hungry. An organization mission tends to be something that is determined by a board of directors. That's official. And a lot of this other information, like your goals, current programs, etc. These should be things that are in your strategic plan. These are things that your board and executive director and program staff should all agree upon. Let's see here. Purpose of grant. Yep, a purpose of grant will vary depending on whether you're seeking general operating support, unrestricted funding, whether it's a special project. In every case, though, a funder is going to want to know the biggest thing that makes a proposal successful is really it's not just a list of what are your programs, who do you serve, what's your geography, what are your numbers. What a grant really is about is what is the need, why do you need to do something about it, and why are you the best people to be doing it. And that is really the core of a successful proposal. Typically, though, funders will also want to know, what are your plans for evaluation? How will you know if you're successful? How do you measure it? If you're using an outside evaluator, who is that person? And then, as I mentioned earlier, usually there are required attachments. Let's see, application tips. Follow the formatting guidelines. Some funders are very strict about page limits, what size font you use. Always answer the questions. What you might find very helpful is to actually use the questions as your headers. Be clear and concise in your language. Be professional. Make sure that you spell check. Don't leave, half-finished sentences. Be careful not to use jargon. Make sure your proposal is something that people can understand. One thing I find really helpful, even though I've been doing this for years and years and years, make sure that you have somebody else read your proposal and they can understand it. Okay, we're going to kind of get into some tricks of the trade here about writing smart objectives. Make sure that your goals are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. So if you're going to do a project that teaches young people, for example, some of the basics of construction, what are those specific skills that people might learn? Will they learn how to use tools? Will they learn how to measure? Will they learn how to read blueprints? How do you know that the goals are measurable? Will you actually build a structure? Are they achievable? If you're going to build a garden, is this something you're going to do over a 3-month summer time period? If you say you're going to do it in 1 week, it may not be achievable or realistic. So things like that are going to matter. It also will tell your funder that what you're doing is something that's viable. We would all like to eradicate poverty and hunger. Those are really big goals, and those probably are not things that you can do in one summer. But you might be able to start a meal program, for example, to bring meals to seniors who are homebound, and something like that is achievable. Make sure your vision, mission, and core values are strong and clear. Your vision statement is really aspirational. This is where you can do really state what you're about. So, for example, I worked for an organization that provides free meals to people with serious and progressive diseases. And the vision statement was, we envision a world where no one who is sick also has to be hungry. Sometimes a workforce developer might say, we envision a world where everybody has a well-paying job. The mission statement, as I said, that's something that a board of directors approves. You can't paraphrase that or change that. Your core values statement, I think this is a really important piece of a proposal. Again, these are the things that really drive you. And this is kind of a fun thing to write about. It could be, again, at Open Arms, where I used to work, we believed no one who was sick should also go hungry. That was a core value. We believed that hunger affected the entire family. So one of the core values was we provided meals to children and caregivers, as well as the person that was actually ill. We believed that people deserved meals that were nutritionally balanced. So things like that reveal kind of your core values and beliefs. Convince your funder you know what you're doing. This is really a fun part of a proposal, I think, to write too. This is where you get to brag about your success stories. If you've done something in the past, maybe you've piloted a program, you can talk about your success. This is where, if you've investigated some needs in your community, maybe this is a new project, but you guys have done your homework. You've interviewed maybe a bunch of senior citizens, and they have told you, you know what, one of our biggest problems to being independent is we can't drive anymore. So maybe you decide, hey, you're going to start an Uber service for senior citizens. Maybe there's a part of your community where people don't have access to fresh food, and you guys decide, we want to build a community garden, and we think it's a great way not only to grow some fresh vegetables, but also to bring people from all kinds of backgrounds together to do something positive. So if you're working on an existing program, you want to make sure you talk about your success. And if you're starting something new, then you want to talk about how you've investigated the problem and why you want to do it. So a good proposal tells a compelling story. It begins with a problem, an opportunity, or need. The middle describes your solution. Just using the example I did, maybe the beginning is there are senior citizens that can't get out of their house to go shopping, or there are people that don't have access to fresh food, or maybe you have young people, children that need after-school tutoring. Whatever your problem is, describe that. The middle is where you talk about how you've arrived at what you're going to do, why you think it is the right solution. And then the end is where you describe your goals and outcomes. So maybe if you're doing, for example, the project where you're helping senior citizens get to the store, your goals might be that X number of people participate in the program, and maybe you do a survey to ask them if it made a difference. Maybe you survey family members to see if they've made, if their relatives are enjoying a better quality of life. Writing a successful grant proposal is not a one-time event. Long-term success depends on sustained, ongoing efforts. That's really true. You know, a lot of times, the first time that you may write a proposal, it may not get funded. So what I always do, if I get a letter that turns a proposal down, please take the time to contact the program officer and just see. Don't be defensive, but just call and say, is there anything I could have done to make our proposal stronger? And often they'll give you very good feedback. They may say, we weren't sure about how many people you were going to serve, or, you know, we had questions about your delivery. Sometimes they'll tell you we simply ran out of money, and they'll encourage you to apply again. If you do get a proposal funded, I always encourage you to maintain your relationship with that program officer. So, you know, let's use the example of the community garden. Let's say you get a proposal, you do get funding to build your garden. You know, the day that you guys get together and you start digging in the dirt, snap a few photos and send it to your funder and say, hey, we're really excited to get started. Maybe when you harvest your vegetables, you send them a couple of vegetables, seriously, and say, hey, you know, this is what we were able to do with your support. Or maybe you have a celebration at the end of planting your garden and you have like a little informal garden party. Make sure you invite your people that have supported you to come see firsthand what their funding has made possible. So always thank your funder and always keep them engaged. You know, I think that's a really fun part. And it gets back to when I was talking about development really being about nurturing relationships. It really is. It is so important to be communicating what a grant makes possible. And because you want to be able to go back to that funder and have them keep supporting you. Let's see, this is a tip. Stop thinking about what your organization does, start thinking about why. Yeah, this is really important. Again, a lot of times, especially I think organizations that have been around for many, many, many years, you know, we tend to think that we deserve support because we've been around forever. You know our name, you know our reputation. And I think it's important to always be thinking about, you know, why are we doing the work that we're doing? And in some cases, there may be other organizations doing similar work. So I think what you want to say is, you know, how are we approaching it differently? Is there a subset of the population? If you're a housing organization, for example, some people serve women and children. Some people serve people coming out of corrections. What are you doing that's maybe different or serving a need that otherwise would not be met? And also, if your organization is evolving, that's really important too, because populations change, communities change. Things happen. Back in the 1980s. We had an AIDS pandemic. That's how Open Arms, the nutrition organization that I talked about, that's how they got started. Back then, they didn't have the cocktails and the drugs to help people. So food was an important part of that. Now that people with HIV are living longer, that particular organization has adapted its nutrition program to help people with multiple sclerosis, women who are recovering from breast cancer. So I think it's important to always think about too, how is the work that you're doing constantly adapting to meet the needs of the community? I might add here another thing that funders are looking at very, very carefully is how are the people that you want to serve, how are they involved in the work you're doing? In other words, are they involved as volunteers? Are they involved as staff and board members? Do you have a community advisory group? If suddenly you say, we want to start serving immigrants in our community, are you going out and doing focus groups and listening sessions? Are you going and meeting with people in those neighborhoods to determine that what you want to do is the right way to do it? Because sometimes we presume that we know what we think is best, but if we really aren't involving the people we want to work with in the problem solving, we're likely to discover that maybe we're making assumptions that aren't correct. And funders are increasingly asking us to say, how did you come up with these solutions? Okay, oops. I think I covered a lot of that right there. Okay, next slide. Don't forget your funders' goals. Yes, this is a really important one. Funders will have very specific, often they have pretty specific outcomes. Make sure that you incorporate their language into your request for support. So, for example, if a foundation says we are especially interested in revitalizing neighborhoods on the north side of Minneapolis, then you want to make sure you say we're requesting support to build a community garden which will help revitalize a neighborhood on the north side. So don't forget your funders' goals and make sure that you are telling them explicitly how your project is going to meet that. Let's see. Tip 8, think beyond this year's funding. We've talked a little bit about this. You want to think about how, if you start a program, you're going to fund it beyond the first year of a grant. One way to do that is to, as I said earlier, really nurture those relationships with your funders so you can go back again. Sometimes funders like to start up a project, and what you might want to say in your proposal is, we're looking to you specifically to give us the money to demonstrate we've got a project that's going to make a difference. And we believe that once we do that, then we'll be able to attract other support from other individuals and businesses and funders in the community. But this is a question that gets asked a lot in proposals. How are you going to sustain your project? And if it's a funder that's willing to help you launch it, then you say, we're looking to you to please help us launch it, demonstrate its success. And once we've demonstrated its success, we're confident we'll attract additional support from the community. All about the relationship. We've talked about that. It is. Make sure too, in your newsletters, on your website, if a funder gives you a grant, I always like to have a success story. I like to communicate it to the public and say, hey, you know, Wells Fargo is helping us do some job training. It's a great way of acknowledging the funder. You know, don't do it unless you have their permission. But it also helps other funders and businesses in your communities see, wow, if Wells Fargo or the McKnight Foundation or somebody thinks that your organization is worthy of support, then, you know, we can get on board with that too. I think we're just about done here. Yeah. So this is the end. I work for an organization called J. Murphy and Associates. We provide development and event and communication support. So that's what we do. And I think that this is the end. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you learned something. And with that, I'll say goodbye.
All right. I think we're good to go.
All right. Thank you. That went a little bit long.
That's okay. And thank you, Kathryn, for joining us. And thank you for everyone watching the stream. So we will see you next time. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.